you don't really have a law. The law can be ignored because there is no consequence to the law being ignored. Now, many people through history and in different organizations use different words, but I have just narrowed the rule of law down to 4 basic universal principles that can be applied everywhere to everyone's benefit. So let me be provocative now and tell you that there are 2 things that many people include that I deliberately do not include: human rights and democracy. Why do I not include human rights and democracy, which are very commonly interlinked? Why do I not include them in my definition of the rule of law? Okay, let me first of all talk about human rights. Firstly, I think it is implied in the establishment of the rule that everyone is treated the same. That's the first point. But I also think human rights is a fascinating and highly political subject all of its own. Let me explain some problems. Maybe there are some things in human rights that are universal, that are generally thought of as being, no matter where you are, these are human rights. Maybe the right not to be killed without judicial authority, maybe. Maybe the right not to be imprisoned without a fair trial, the due process provision I mentioned. Maybe the right not to have your property taken away without process of law, although perhaps communists would disagree with me. But what about other things? Abortion, the right to a home, the right to education. Are these human rights, or are they rights established by a civilized society, which is something different? If you had asked someone in the year 1500, is the right to education a human right? When they stopped laughing at you, they would have said no. Yeah? But now many people consider that the right to education is a human right. What about in the future? Will the right to internet access become a human right? Yeah? My point here is that human rights are political. They change like the wind through time. They are not absolutes. I've just shown you how they change, so they can't possibly be absolutes. Or maybe they are absolutes for this moment, but not next week. My quest here is for an absolute, timeless foundation for the rule of law. Human rights, right though they are not historically immovable. Let me call upon some evidence to support that. At the United Nations, at the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations said, "It is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law." Yeah? So ultimately, although I criticize them, I call upon that phrase from the United Nations in support of my contention that the rule of law delivers human rights. They are not one and the same thing. That the rule of law delivers justice. They are not one and the same thing. This is a foundation that is required before you can get the other 2. Now let me talk about democracy. I'm going to be controversial here and suggest that democracy is not a crucial or necessary element of the rule of law. Let me give you something like this. In Plato's Republic, for example, he imagines a system of government where enlightened people rule for the benefit of all, and there is no need for democracy. Is it possible to imagine a hereditary ruler? Is it possible to imagine maybe even Hammurabi, where some kind of unelected or sole ruler rules in accordance with the rule of law? I think it is possible to imagine it. We might not have seen it yet, but it is possible to imagine such a thing. And let me put the other side to you. Have you seen democratic pressure to force the rule of law to be sidestepped or diminished? I think we have. I think we are seeing it in the world at the moment. I can think, for example, of places like Turkey, where the president has become practically autocratic, with the full support of the population. So, what am I saying here? Democracy in itself has never been a guarantor of the rule of law. It is both good and bad in its effects on the rule of law. So I will follow a rule of philosophy known as Occam's razor, which says that anything which isn't strictly necessary for my proposition can be discarded. I am discarding the principle of democracy from the rule of law because it isn't strictly necessary. You can, by all means, have a think and discussion about that. I like to be provocative. Now, I'm not arguing democracy is a bad thing. That is a different point entirely. I'm just simply saying it is not strictly necessary for the principles of the rule of law to be advanced. Now, let me say something else that comes from that conclusion. I'm making no comment on the political structures or systems of government. I have taken political systems or individual governments out of the debate of the rule of law. No government in the world, as currently constituted, should fear my 4 principles of the rule of law. And that's how I believe we will start to make progress. The rule of law is dependent upon itself and not particular systems. Let me be even clearer. As I've said, I make this point time and time again. This is not the West telling the rest how to behave. Yeah? Mistakes have been made in the past trying to do that, trying to impose systems on people that weren't either politically or culturally ready for it. It is the wrong way to approach it. The way to advance the rule of law is to build up from universal foundations and then allow people to decide how they move forward. So that is basically the difference between what is known as the substantive or thin rule of law definition and the broad or narrow definition. Thick or thin rule of law is how it's commonly divided. So those broad definitions, what happens is that when you include things like human rights and democracy and justice even into the discussion of human rights, what you end up with is eventually and very, very soon a discussion of politics. That is the inevitable consequence of the nature of a discussion that doesn't stick to the narrow definition of the rule of law that I have done. And I believe that when you start talking politics, you are only ever heard by the people who already agree with you. And so the way that we have to advance this is to advance from basics. Let me just talk now, again, another global thing that I want to mention. I started by talking about the difference between the rule of law and rule by law. So when someone says, well, we've got laws, what's the problem? The problem is that we end up being very careful now about how we define what we're talking about. So let me first of all talk about how the concept travels around the world. The translation of the expression rule of law into different languages is the very start of the problem itself. If I say in French, état de droit, that can be reversed back into English as a state of law. That is not what the rule of law means. If I say in the German, Rechtsstaat, basically the same thing, state law, yeah, the law of the state. Yeah. And if I do it in Spanish, I don't know what it is in Portuguese, but Estado de Derecho, yeah, is the same thing. It has similar meanings, state of law. Yeah. My personal preference is to use the expression imperio de la ley, which is trying to convey a different concept than Estado de Derecho. Yeah. So again, I think this is very important, how we talk about it around the world and the words we use to avoid confusion. I'm trying to say to you that no matter what language we speak in, try to convey the 4 principles. Nobody is above the law, an independent judiciary. The law must be accessible, and you must have access to remedy. however you describe those 4 principles. So the difference between the rule by law and rule of law is very simple. Like a mathematician, I'm going to say that the rule of law, what I'm advocating, is a scenario where all 4 principles exist and are currently active. A rule by law is a system where one or more of those principles is absent. Yeah? So, for example, you can look back to somewhere like Nazi Germany, where there was laws. There were laws. There were lots of them. But there was no independence of the judiciary, there was no equality before the law, etc. So some of the other principles were missing, which is why I won't go into the German situation. I'm just using it as an example of the fact that you can have a situation where there are laws, but where these 4 principles are absent, you have rule by law, not the rule of law. Now let me talk to you about the economics of the rule of law. This is very important. This is my business case now. This is how I'm going to say to you, okay, so if I take the politics out of the rule of law, what arguments am I equipping you with to say that this is a good thing to do, no matter who you are? I'm going to talk about hard cash, the benefits to society of the rule of law. The first reason we have to support the rule of law is that we think it's right. We think it's logical. The second reason I'm arguing is that the rule of law is the foundation for all other rights, for all other laws. You can have anti-human trafficking law, environmental policies, you can have anti-corruption policies, and all of them are just words on a piece of paper without the rule of law to support them. This is how foundational it is. No rule of law, no contract system, no rule of law, no land law process, no rule of law, no protection against personal injury. The whole thing falls down. And this is the importance and the importance of the message. But now let me turn to the economic argument. I'm not looking at the economics of laws, I'm looking at the economic effect of the rule of law on any society where it has ever been measured. Yeah. So we know, for example, instinctively, I think, that where the instability of a legal system reaches high or endemic levels, investment can't take place because the investment is incapable of being protected. Low investment results in low economic growth. Another way of saying it is, if you can't get your contract enforced, why would you bother to contract? If you can't get your investment protected, why would you bother to invest? There's a simple answer to that, and that is that over the medium term, you don't invest, you don't contract, you don't do all of those things that the rule of law is necessary to support economic activity. What we have done at LexisNexis, this is available on our website, the LexisNexis Rule of Law website, is that we have taken a very good rule of law measure put together by the World Justice Project. It's a very extensive measure. It takes them 2 years to update it. There are over 100 different criteria, and then a country's rule of law index is plotted. And we plotted it against the other socio-economic criteria. So I have graphs that I can't display for you today, but as I say, they are on the website, and you can play around with an interactive little thing that moves countries up and down and things like this. But the graph plots, first of all, the rule of law against per capita GDP. There is a striking correlation. The lower your rule of law measure, the lower your per capita GDP. It directly impacts. If you move a country's rule of law index by 1%, this is what happens. You increase each person's per capita income by over $700 per annum. The crime rate, that is to say homicide rate, drops by 1 to 2% with each movement of the rule of law index. Even infant mortality rates are lower in environments where the rule of law is stronger. Corruption rates, again, are lower You might think, obviously, but there is a direct correlation. What am I saying here? I'm saying here that we have the statistical evidence to show that your country, your society, is more prosperous the higher up the rule of law index you move. This is very important, and so the economic evidence is strong. The rule of law pays back a long and sustained dividend in economics. This is the argument, of course, that's important to the business community, but I'm suggesting to everybody that this is an argument that ought to be important to non-political advocacy of the rule of law. The data is there. We have produced it. It is available to everyone to see. The argument is uncontestable. If you do these four things, basically, and improve the rule of law in the four definitions that I have spoken about, you will have a more prosperous society. And that is an important point of advocacy that I think everybody, including the judiciary, can use. The final thing that I wanted to talk about is that this is also becoming increasingly important to the legal profession because, and this may be slightly less relevant to the judicial members of the audience, but to lawyers, what used to be called corporate social responsibility, and where traditionally lawyers, particularly in civil code countries, would say, I'm not your conscience. If this isn't written down in the law, it's got nothing to do with me. Yeah? There are a number of things that are happening in the world, like competition, like the regulation of corporate social responsibility, and like the importance increasingly of reputation, that are making it more and more important that the legal profession becomes very much more familiar in advocating things that were previously thought of as being outside the remit of lawyers. And so that is an increasing trend that I think is very, very important. The traditional model of the legal firm, the law firm, in many developed markets now is coming under threat. The global financial crisis has produced a different attitude amongst companies to a lot of these kind of things. So there are many, many important issues that I could go on about which directly affect the legal profession, but which I won't talk about at this particular meeting because it perhaps isn't so relevant. Just as an example, by the way, of the way that the law and corporate social responsibility are increasingly coming together, let me give you some quick examples from around the world. One, the UK, that I'm familiar with. There is a new company that you are able to form, which is called the Social Impact Company. It's not a not-for-profit. You are allowed to make profits, but a certain minimum percentage of your profits have to be recycled into the good cause for which the company has been founded. In India, the Companies Act of 2013 and the regulations under it requires every qualifying company, which is there's a financial threshold, must spend at least 2% of its average net profit for the preceding 3 years on corporate social responsibility activities. You can see the line is blurring between what was previously thought of as a social, moral type of activity and what is now increasingly becoming something that the lawyers have to get interested in and have to be aware of. And in my view, there is no bigger corporate social responsibility imperative for business than the rule of law. A little statistic for you. I know we like facts occasionally. The top 5 listed mutual investment funds focus on investing socially responsible in socially responsible companies have $4 trillion of assets under management. This is the increasing economic importance of corporate social responsibility activities and companies that do things in there. Here is my point. My point is that, as you can hear from what I'm saying, I'm trying to get the legal community to talk to business in the language of business and not just in the language of law. It is very persuasive. I can tell you, I sit next to a finance director in my office, and there's nothing he likes more than a spreadsheet. And so proving that these numbers add up is very, very important. So let me finally turn to my conclusions. You'll be relieved to hear I'm coming to my conclusions now. What I've tried to do, and I'll sum up my points in a very simple manner, is one, the rule of law has a long and global history as a concept dating far back into history. It is not the preserve of one part of the world. There is no one part of the world that can claim the moral high ground with regard to the rule of law. So we have to get out of that mindset that some country is lecturing another country on how to behave. The rule of law is, therefore, a transferable concept. Even when we use different and confusing expressions around the world. I've tried to show a very simple way to explain the rule of law and rule by law as a difference, and also the compelling reasons why the rule of law is a fundamental legal concept upon which all others depend for their effectiveness. It's the right thing to do, and it's good for the economy. In a report that was written in 2010, Gary Haugen and Victor Boutros wrote it for the United Nations, called "And Justice for All." They quoted a UN report which said that today, 4 billion people around the world live outside of the protection of the rule of law. That's billion. 4,000 million people are still living outside of the protection of the rule of law. Now, not only is that bad and unfair for them, but let me be very brutal to you, that's an awful lot of economic potential that's being held back as well for the good of the world. By advancing the rule of law as a subject, we can do a lot of secondary good. And so I ask everyone that I talk to that when there are news reports of governments taking some arbitrary action, trying to exclude the courts from decisions, or exclude people from access to justice, I ask everybody to remember that isn't a problem just for the victim involved. It becomes an economic problem for us all. And when you see governments taking action contrary to the rule of law, simply for short-term convenience, for whatever the pressure may be upon them, it is a slippery slope to eventual tyranny. I hope you are all, as very powerful, influential, and admirable people, that you will be on your guard to help us stop going down that slope. There are many challenges to the rule of law around the world, but progress requires that we never